3 years ago today, Vladimir Putin sent his forces into Ukraine. On that morning, we brought you the latest live as it happened.
Good morning, it's 6 o'clock. This is Asma Mir and Stig Abel with Times Radio Breakfast.
The headlines: explosions are heard around Ukraine as President Putin launches a military operation. President Biden says he will hold Russia to account, and Boris Johnson promises the UK will respond decisively.
Ahead, we'll be live in Kiev and Moscow and hear reaction from the US overnight. We'll also get political reaction from...
There we go, we called it Kiev. Then, and you doing the Sunday programme, weren't you?
Yeah, and people would message in and say it's Kyiv, not Kiev. Yeah.
It was just a moment where this wasn't a major part of our lives. And of course, it's become a major part of, as Kate was saying, all political calculus in the last 3 years. That morning, of course, it was feared Ukraine would fall quickly. The Americans offered to rescue President Zelensky. He told them, "I need ammunition, not a ride." And Ukraine held out. The column of tanks heading for Kyiv was stopped and pushed back. In the 3 years that have followed, hundreds of thousands of people have died. This week, Keir Starmer and France's President Macron head to see Donald Trump to try to create a future that doesn't reward Russia for invading. Yuri Sak is a ministerial advisor who we've spoken to a lot in the last 3 years or so. He sent us a voice note this morning sharing his thoughts.
We want to end this war more than any other nation on the planet. And we know that there is only one way to end this war, is to achieve just peace through force. And this can be achieved in 2025 if Euro-Atlantic unity stands the test of these historic times. And our unity has to be based on our common understanding of simple truths. That it was Russia who started this war. It is Russia which is a terrorist state and which has committed a crime of aggression. And that's why in the negotiating process, which is now being considered and has already begun, whatever decisions are taken, they have to be based on these simple facts. We, of course, want to say thank you to all our partners who have been with us in these difficult times.
Yeah, does that include America still is the absent question in all of that. The Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey, is in Ukraine. We spoke to him a lot over the last couple of years or so. Jerome, morning to you.
Morning, Stig. Thank you for having me on.
Great pleasure. You've been there off and on in Ukraine for a long time. How does it feel today, 3 years in? Does it feel like a country about to strike a peace deal? Does it feel like a country that's struggling to continue a war? What's your sense of the place?
Well, Stig, there's a strange, almost paradoxical combination of two sensations. One is familiar, and that's the sort of stoicism and the resilience that I've encountered throughout this conflict. People just determined simply to carry on doing what they're doing, and that's carrying on fighting, and that's also carrying on normal life. That's one of the striking things, is that how quickly and in so many places how much of normal life has managed to return despite the sort of daily threat of airstrikes. And we've seen just 24 hours ago one of the largest drone strike of the 3-year war. But at the same time as that, there's another feeling which is also familiar but less familiar, and that's just the sense that people are reeling from events and reeling from what feels like they've been stabbed in the back by America as Washington appears to realign its allegiances, and this initiative by Donald Trump and his top officials to align themselves with Russia and Russia's interests so much more closely. And that sense of reeling is also familiar because that's how we felt this time 3 years ago, that sense of utter shock and disbelief that Russia really had done it. Because, of course, you remember there was so much build-up, there'd been so much build-up in 2022, but we'd sort of been through it before, the year before, where there'd been this huge military build-up on the Ukrainian borders, but then Russia had stepped back from the brink. And I think perhaps there's a hope that we might see some sort of stepping back from the brink this time from America, but far less certain about which way things are going. And the overriding sense is that Ukrainians are carrying on. They remain determined to try and continue to ensure their freedom, but they are unsure at the moment, understandably, of how much support they will continue to get from the United States.
So Donald Trump is often a name mentioned by Ukrainians you speak to. His view of Zelensky, his criticisms of Zelensky, his support for Putin, that's kind of common discourse among Ukrainians.
Donald Trump's name absolutely on their lips in the same way that, in a very different way to how Boris Johnson's name was on their lips.
Yeah.
This has been a unique experience as a British journalist. The sort of enthusiasm that British people are met with over here, in large part down to the sort of support that Britain has given. And do you remember Boris Johnson being the first world leader to come to Kyiv when the city was at war? Those sort of not just symbolic, but also really substantial gestures of financial and military support. Donald Trump's name said significantly less kindly here in Ukraine, but just because of that uncertainty. But we heard from President Zelensky yesterday. He was attempting to be significantly more diplomatic, but he didn't hide the fact that the two men have a very difficult relationship and have done for a long time. I think he said it's never been the best. Trump and Zelensky have history, and there's a lot of speculation that history may be partly what's driving Donald Trump towards the Kremlin so fast and so seriously.
So how serious was Zelensky, in your view, when he said, I'll exchange this job for greater security? If you get promised NATO membership for Ukraine, I'll step aside as president. Is that a serious thing? And presumably at some point, even if the Ukrainians love Zelensky, they might say, well, if Donald Trump doesn't like him, Donald Trump is the most powerful man in the world for the next 4 years. We can't afford to stand up to Donald Trump very much at all. So maybe Zelensky has to go.
I think it was a serious comment. It was one comment during a really long, a sort of 2-hour press conference to mark the anniversary of the war. And what he said far more frequently was that he'd been pragmatic. He was asked about his reaction to Donald Trump's criticisms. Donald Trump had called Zelensky a dictator, said he's doing a terrible job, and trotted out this line that Zelensky's approval rating is 4%. Factually, the 4% approval rating is not correct, and Zelensky's not a dictator. We've heard from other world leaders who pointed out that he was democratically elected and that Ukraine has been forced to suspend elections under martial law because it's in conflict. So Zelensky insisting that he is pragmatic, and I think his comment about standing down fits within that framework of pragmatism. And essentially what he was saying is that if it was the obstacle to peace, or if Ukraine would get NATO membership, then he would step down. He wouldn't stand in the way, and he'd do that quickly. Because fundamentally, Zelensky, like most people here, want to end this war as fast as possible. No one really wants this slaughter and the threat of airstrikes across all of Ukraine's cities to go on any longer than it has to. But they realize here that it's not just when it ends, but how it ends is important. And what Zelensky kept on saying yesterday is that Ukraine needs security guarantees. It can't just accept the word of Vladimir Putin that he will pause hostilities and that will be the end of it. Because Ukraine, remember, was in conflict since 2014 with Russia, when it effectively triggered, when it annexed Crimea and fomented unrest in the Donbass and later annexed those Donetsk and Luhansk provinces. And the Minsk Accords, the Minsk agreements to try and end that conflict or to freeze that conflict just failed again and again and again. And there's no one in Kyiv who wants to find themselves in that situation all over again, history repeating itself, the world forgetting and turning away largely, whilst a sort of, if not a hot war, but a warm conflict continues to rumble on. At the moment, it is very much a hot war. They want it to end, fundamentally and sustainably. They want that peace to last.
Yeah, Jerome, thank you so much for being our eyes and ears on the ground over the last 3 years. We've really appreciated it.
Thanks, Nick.
That's Jerome Starkey, there, the Sun's defence editor, one of several people whose name you'll have heard quite often over the last 3 years, who've been in Kyiv and in various parts of Ukraine trying to tell us what's been going on. But I guess the fundamentals are the same, Kate. The fundamentals are, it is a war, Ukraine need it to stop, but they can't let it stop just anyhow, because the problem, they don't trust Russia, and Russia have given the world no reason to trust it as a nation over the last 10, 20 years.
Yeah, and something I think we're going to get into today across the programme is, was it a good idea over the last year or so, when the talk about peace and conclusion has come up, the line has consistently been, it's for Ukraine to start those conversations. It's not for us to talk about ending the war or how it ends. And in doing that, in sort of leaving that space open, Donald Trump has now filled that space. And is there more that could have been? There's been a lot of work behind the scenes. I mean, don't forget, Macron and Starmer have met many, many times, talked many times about what a peace agreement could look like. But while they have been talking and hoping that Europe would support their efforts, Donald Trump has now come in and taken over.
We were also told, weren't we? And this felt, I mean, this is the way I suspect wars have always worked. If you're fighting a war, you always have to have propaganda that you're going to win. But we spent a lot of the last 3 years hearing people, including British politicians, saying, oh no, Ukraine can still win this. Ukraine can still win this. Ukraine can still win this. And actually, it seems that's certainly not been true for a couple of years.
Well, I think it was always the idea that Ukraine should win, but what does winning mean? And winning always meant that there had to be a good conclusion to this, where Ukraine was able to be a safe country with security guarantees. That has always been the end goal here. I don't think we were ever talking about winning in the sense that you would be able to remove Russia completely.
But people were definitely saying that.
I think when pushed, people often said things like, it's important for Ukraine to be as strong as they possibly can be. If you listen back, most politicians very cleverly dodged saying that they could win, because most understood they never could technically win. But winning was always about the end game. And I think the really big question now is, what does that look like for Ukraine? And that's what we'll be talking about through the programme today.